What is happening here?
There's nothing left to say right now about that.
In long-running reality series, there are moments that feel routine. Familiar scenes, repeated dynamics, conversations that seem like just another part of the story. But every so often, something happens that breaks that pattern completely. A moment that doesn't just continue the story, it changes it. And for fans of Sister Wives, this was one of those moments. Because what Kody Brown said in this particular conversation didn't just spark a reaction, it shifted the entire narrative. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual. The setting was familiar. The tone started off controlled. Another discussion, another attempt to address ongoing tension within the family. But underneath that calm surface, something was building. Something different. Because this wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about confronting something that had been left unspoken for a long time. And when those kinds of truths finally come out, they rarely stay contained. They expand. They affect everything. For years, viewers have watched the relationships within the Brown family evolve. They've seen the ups and downs, the moments of connection, the moments of conflict. But through it all, there was always a sense that certain things remained unsaid. Hints, tension, unresolved emotions that never fully came to the surface. Until now. This conversation brought those emotions forward in a way that couldn't be ignored. Because what Kody expressed wasn't just a reaction to the moment. It felt like a reflection of everything that had been building over time. And that's what made it so powerful. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, but it was clear. And clarity in a situation like this can be more impactful than any argument. For Christine Brown, moments like these carry a different weight. Because when you've spent years trying to communicate, trying to express what you need, trying to find understanding, and then suddenly something shifts, it forces you to reassess everything. Not just the present, but the past as well. And that's exactly what fans began to notice. The reaction wasn't just about what was said. It was about what it meant, the implications, the underlying message that seemed to connect back to so many previous conversations. With Janelle Brown, the dynamic has always been more grounded, more practical. But even within that approach, there are moments where the reality of a situation becomes undeniable, and this felt like one of those moments. A point where logic meets emotion, and both lead to the same conclusion, that something fundamental has changed. For Meri Brown, conversations like this often carry layers: history, emotion, uncertainty. And when something significant is said, it doesn't just land in the present. It echoes through everything that came before. Because relationships like these aren't built on single moments. They're built on years of interaction, years of conversations that shape how each new moment is understood. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose position in the family has often appeared more aligned with Kody. And that alignment becomes even more noticeable in conversations like this. Because when one perspective seems steady while others are shifting, it creates contrast. And that contrast becomes part of the story. But beyond the individual reactions, there's something bigger happening here. Because this conversation didn't just reveal something about one relationship, it revealed something about the entire structure of the family. The way communication has evolved, the way priorities have shifted, the way certain patterns have formed over time. For viewers of Sister Wives, this is where everything starts to feel different. Because once something is said, once it's out in the open, it can't be taken back. It becomes part of the narrative, part of how every future moment will be interpreted. And that's exactly what happened here. Fans didn't just hear what Kody said, they connected it to past conversations, to previous decisions, to patterns they had started to recognize. And suddenly, this one moment felt much bigger than itself. It felt like confirmation, like a missing piece of the puzzle had finally been revealed. And when that happens, it changes how everything is seen. Because now, every interaction carries more meaning. Every conversation feels more significant. Every reaction is analyzed in a new way. What makes this even more compelling is how subtle the shift was. There was no dramatic announcement, no single explosive moment, just words, carefully spoken, but deeply impactful. And that's often how the biggest changes begin, quietly, but with consequences that ripple outward. For Kody Brown, this moment represents more than just a conversation. It represents a turning point, a moment where what was once implied became explicit, where what was once uncertain became clear. And clarity, especially in complex relationships, can be both powerful and difficult, because it forces everyone involved to confront reality,
to see things as they are, not as they were or as they hoped they would be. And that's where the real impact lies. Because once reality is clear, decisions follow. Changes happen, paths shift. And that's exactly what we're beginning to see. As we move into the next part, we'll break down exactly what was said and why those words have sparked such a strong reaction among fans. Because sometimes it's not just about the conversation itself, it's about the truth it reveals. After that unexpected shift in part 1, fans of Sister Wives were left asking one major question. What exactly did Kody Brown say that made this conversation feel so different? Because it wasn't just the tone, it wasn't just the setting, it was the words themselves. The kind of words that don't just fill a moment, they redefine it. At first, the conversation followed a familiar pattern. There was tension, but it was controlled. Careful phrasing, measured responses, the kind of communication viewers had seen many times before. But then something shifted. Kody's words became more direct, more revealing, less filtered. And that's when everything changed. Because instead of navigating around the issue, he addressed it in a way that felt final. Not aggressive, not explosive, but clear. And clarity can be more powerful than emotion. What stood out to fans wasn't just what he said, it was what his words implied. The message beneath the message. Because sometimes the most impactful part of a conversation isn't the surface meaning, it's the underlying truth. And in this case, that truth seemed to point towards something fans had suspected for a long time, that the dynamics within the family had fundamentally shifted, that certain relationships were no longer functioning the way they once had, and that this wasn't temporary, it was the new reality. For Christine Brown, hearing words like that carries a different kind of weight, because when you've spent years trying to communicate, trying to create change, trying to hold on to something, and then you hear something that confirms your fears, it changes everything. It doesn't just affect how you feel in that moment, it reshapes how you see the entire relationship. And that's exactly what fans began to notice. Her reaction wasn't just emotional, it was reflective, as if those words connected to something she had already been feeling for a long time. With Janelle Brown, the response felt more internal, less outwardly emotional, but still significant. Janelle has always approached situations with logic and practicality, but even the most practical perspective can't ignore clarity when it's presented so directly. Because once something is clearly defined, it becomes impossible to misunderstand. And that forces a different kind of response. Not immediate, not dramatic, but thoughtful, measured. A shift in perspective that happens beneath the surface. For Meri Brown, words like these don't exist in isolation. They connect to years of history, years of conversations that may not have led to resolution. And when something this clear is said, it doesn't just impact the present. It echoes through all those past moments. It reframes them. It gives them new meaning. Because suddenly, things that once felt uncertain begin to make more sense. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose position in conversations like this often appears more aligned with Kody, and that alignment becomes more noticeable when the conversation reaches this level of clarity. Because when one person's words feel definitive, the reactions around them reveal just as much as the words themselves. And in this case, that contrast became part of what made the moment so impactful. But beyond individual reactions, there's something else that made this conversation stand out: finality. There was a sense that what was being said wasn't open-ended. It wasn't part of an ongoing negotiation. It felt like a conclusion, and that's what caught fans' attention. Because conversations in the past often felt like attempts to fix things, to find middle ground, to keep the structure intact. But this felt different. It felt like an acknowledgement that the structure had already changed, and that acknowledgement carries weight, because once something is acknowledged, it becomes real. It becomes something that has to be addressed. For viewers of Sister Wives, this moment marked a turning point in how they understood the entire story, because it provided clarity, a clearer understanding of where things stand, of what has changed, of what can and cannot be repaired. And that clarity doesn't just affect the people in the conversation, it affects everyone watching, because it shifts perspective, it changes interpretation, it turns speculation into understanding. Another reason these words had such a strong impact is timing. This conversation didn't happen early in the story. It happened after years of buildup, after patterns had already formed, after emotions had already been expressed multiple times, which means these words didn't come out of nowhere. They were the result of everything that came before, and that's what gives them their weight, because they feel earned. They feel like the natural conclusion of a long process. And when something feels like a conclusion, it changes how people respond. It moves them from questioning to accepting, from wondering what might happen to understanding what is happening. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how these words didn't just change the moment, they changed the direction of every relationship involved. Because once something this clear is said, nothing moves forward the same way again.
After the words spoken by Kody Brown in that pivotal conversation on Sister Wives, something changed, and it wasn't subtle. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic moment where everything suddenly collapsed. Instead, the shift was quiet, gradual, but unmistakable. Because once clarity enters a situation, it begins to reshape everything around it. And that's exactly what started happening here. The dynamic between the family members didn't explode, it adjusted. Small changes in tone, in body language, in how conversations continued after that moment. And for viewers paying close attention, those small changes spoke volumes. For Christine Brown, the shift felt like confirmation. Not a surprise, not something new, but something that validated what she had already been feeling. Because when you've been trying to communicate something for years, and then you hear words that align with your experience, it changes your perspective. It removes doubt. It replaces uncertainty with clarity. And once that happens, the way you move forward becomes very different. There's less hesitation, less second-guessing, more certainty in your decisions. And fans began to notice that change, not just in what Christine said, but in how she carried herself afterward. There was a sense of finality, as if the conversation had closed a chapter that had been open for far too long. With Janelle Brown, the shift was more internal, less visible on the surface, but still present. Janelle has always approached situations with a calm, practical mindset. But even within that framework, clarity has an effect. Because when something becomes clear, it changes how you process everything else. It influences your priorities, your expectations, your willingness to continue certain patterns. And in Janelle's case, fans began to notice a subtle distancing. Not dramatic, not confrontational, but intentional. A quiet shift toward independence, toward focusing on what made sense for her, rather than trying to maintain a dynamic that no longer felt stable. For Meri Brown, the impact of that conversation was layered, because her relationship history is complex, full of moments that didn't fully resolve. So when something this clear is said, it doesn't just affect the present, it reframes the past. It makes previous conversations easier to understand. It provides context for moments that once felt confusing. And that kind of clarity can be both helpful and difficult. Helpful because it brings understanding, difficult because it confirms realities that may not be easy to accept. And that internal process is something fans have seen reflected in her journey. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose position in the family has often appeared more aligned with Kody. And that alignment becomes even more noticeable when everything else is shifting. Because while some relationships are adjusting, others appear steady. And that contrast becomes part of the overall dynamic. It highlights the differences. It raises questions. It becomes something viewers analyze more closely. But beyond individual reactions, there's a larger shift happening here. Because when one major conversation introduces clarity, it changes how every future conversation unfolds. The tone becomes different, more direct, less cautious. Because once something has been acknowledged, there's no need to avoid it anymore. And that changes everything. Conversations that might have once circled around issues now address them more directly. Reactions become more honest, less filtered. And while that honesty can be difficult, it also moves things forward, even if forward means moving in a different direction than before. For viewers of Sister Wives, this is where the story becomes even more compelling, because it's no longer about guessing what might happen. It's about watching how people respond to what has already been revealed. And that creates a different kind of tension, one that's rooted in reality rather than uncertainty. Because now the question isn't what's going on, it's what happens next. And that question carries weight, because the answer doesn't just affect one relationship. It affects the entire family, the structure, the future, everything. Another key aspect of this shift is how it changes perception, not just for the people involved, but for the audience as well. Because once clarity is introduced, it becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed. Past moments are reinterpreted, current interactions are analyzed more deeply, and future decisions are anticipated with a different level of understanding. And that's exactly what fans are experiencing now. A deeper awareness of the dynamics at play, a clearer understanding of how things reach this point, and a stronger sense of where things might go from here. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how this shift in dynamics begins to lead to more direct confrontations, moments where everything that has been building beneath the surface finally comes into the open. Because when clarity changes the foundation, the next step is often confrontation. After the shift that followed that pivotal conversation on Sister Wives, it didn't take long for things to move into a new phase. Because clarity doesn't stay quiet. Once something is fully understood, it demands to be addressed. And that's exactly what began to happen. What had once been subtle tension started becoming direct confrontation. Not chaotic, not explosive right away, but undeniably more honest, more open, more difficult to avoid. For Kody Brown, this meant facing conversations that were no longer filtered, no longer softened, no longer built around keeping the peace. Instead, they became focused on truth, on reality, on what each person was actually feeling rather than what they hoped could still be fixed. And that shift changed the tone completely. For Christine Brown, this was a defining stage, because once she reached clarity, there was no reason to hold back anymore. Her conversations became more direct, more certain, less about asking questions, and more about stating where she stood. And that kind of communication carries a different kind of weight, because it doesn't leave room for misunderstanding. It doesn't circle around the issue. It addresses it head on. Fans began to notice that her tone wasn't driven by emotion alone, it was driven by resolution, a sense that she had already processed everything internally and was now simply expressing the conclusion she had reached. With Janelle Brown, confrontation looked different, less emotional on the surface, but just as meaningful. Janelle's approach remained grounded, but there were moments where her words carried more firmness than before, more boundaries, more clarity about what she was willing, or no longer willing, to accept. And that shift was significant, because when someone who is usually calm begins to set clear boundaries, it signals that something important has changed, that the situation has reached a point where staying neutral is no longer an option. For Meri Brown, confrontation didn't always appear in the same outward way, but it was there, in the questions she asked, in the moments where she sought clarity, in the quiet realization that certain answers were no longer vague, they were becoming more defined. And that kind of confrontation can be just as powerful as a direct argument, because it forces acknowledgement. It brings things into focus. It removes the ability to ignore what's really happening. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose role in these confrontations often added another layer, because while other relationships were facing increased tension, her connection with Kody appeared more aligned. And that contrast naturally became part of the discussion, part of the questions being raised, part of the emotions being expressed. Because when one relationship remains stable while others are struggling, it becomes impossible not to notice, and that difference adds intensity to every conversation. What makes this phase so important is that these confrontations didn't come out of nowhere. They were built over time, from repeated conversations, from unresolved issues, from patterns that had been developing long before this moment. And that's why they feel so impactful, because they represent more than just disagreement. They represent accumulation, everything that had been building beneath the surface, finally coming into the open. For viewers of Sister Wives, this is where the story becomes impossible to look away from, because confrontation brings clarity in a way that nothing else can. It forces people to say what they've been holding back, to acknowledge what they've been avoiding, to face what can no longer be ignored. But what's even more important is what happens after. Because once confrontation happens, things can't go back to how they were. The dynamic changes, expectations shift, and decisions begin to take shape. Because when the truth is fully expressed, it demands action. And that's exactly where the story is heading next. As we move into part 5, we'll explore how these confrontations begin to turn into real, life-changing decisions, and why those decisions now feel inevitable rather than surprising. Because once everything is out in the open, something has to change.
After the confrontations reached their peak on Sister Wives, something became clear. There was no going back. Because once everything has been said, once emotions are fully expressed, and the truth is out in the open, conversations stop being about understanding and start becoming about action. For Kody Brown, this phase marked a turning point. The conversations were no longer theoretical, no longer attempts to fix things through discussion alone. They had reached a point where decisions had to be made, and those decisions wouldn't just affect one relationship. They would reshape the entire family dynamic. For Christine Brown, the path from confrontation to decision was direct, because once she had expressed everything she needed to say, and once it became clear that those needs weren't going to be met in the way she hoped, the next step became unavoidable. Her decision wasn't impulsive. It wasn't driven by one emotional moment. It was the result of years of conversations that led to the same conclusion, that the relationship as it existed could no longer give her what she needed. And when that realization becomes clear, the decision that follows often feels inevitable. Fans could see it, not just in what she said, but in how she carried herself. There was certainty, a sense of closure, as if the conversation had confirmed what she already knew deep down. With Janelle Brown, the transition from confrontation to decision was quieter, but equally powerful. Janelle's approach has always been grounded in practicality, so rather than reacting immediately, she processed, observed, considered what made sense for her moving forward. And over time, that process led to a shift, a movement toward independence, toward making decisions based on her own needs, rather than trying to maintain a structure that no longer felt balanced. Her decisions didn't come with dramatic announcements, but they were visible in her actions, in her priorities, in the way she began to define her own path. For Meri Brown, the connection between confrontation and decision was more complex, because her journey has always been layered, less about a single turning point and more about a gradual evolution. The confrontations brought clarity, but that clarity didn't immediately translate into one clear decision. Instead, it began to reshape how she saw her situation, her role, her future. And that internal shift is a form of decision in itself, because it changes how someone moves forward, even if the external changes happen more slowly. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose experience during this phase remained more stable.
Her relationship with Kody continued to appear aligned, and because of that, the transition from confrontation to decision didn't carry the same level of disruption. But that stability became part of the overall contrast, because while some relationships were changing dramatically, hers remained consistent, and that difference made the decisions of the others even more noticeable. What's important to understand is that these decisions didn't come from nowhere. They were built on everything that came before: the conversations, the patterns, the emotional distance, the confrontations. All of it led to this point. And that's why, for viewers of Sister Wives, these decisions don't feel shocking anymore. They feel like the natural outcome of a long process. Because when you follow the story step by step, the direction becomes clear. And once the direction is clear, the decisions that follow make sense. Another key element in this phase is emotional clarity, because decisions like these aren't just about external circumstances. They're about internal realization, understanding what you need, recognizing what isn't working, and accepting that continuing the same path will not lead to a different result. That kind of clarity is powerful, because once you have it, it becomes very difficult to ignore. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. For Kody Brown, these decisions represent more than just changes in individual relationships. They represent a transformation of the entire family structure, because when multiple people begin to move in different directions, the system itself has to change, and that change affects everything: the dynamic, the expectations, the future. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how these decisions didn't just impact individual relationships, they completely redefined what the Brown family looks like moving forward. Because when decisions like these are made, nothing stays the same.
After the decisions that followed those intense confrontations on Sister Wives, the Brown family entered a phase that felt completely different from anything viewers had seen before. Because this wasn't just about change, it was about transformation. The kind of transformation that doesn't just adjust the structure, it redefines it entirely. For Kody Brown, this meant stepping into a reality that looked nothing like the one he had spent years building. The idea of a unified, interconnected family, multiple relationships functioning together, was no longer the central dynamic. Instead, what remained was something more fragmented, more individual, more reflective of separate paths rather than a shared one. And that kind of shift is significant, because when the foundation of a family changes, everything built on it changes too. For Christine Brown, this transformation was the beginning of something new. Her decision to step away didn't just remove her from the original structure, it allowed her to redefine her identity outside of it. She moved from being part of a collective system to creating a life based on her own needs, her own priorities, her own vision of happiness. And that kind of change carries both freedom and responsibility, because while independence opens new doors, it also requires building something entirely new. Fans could see that shift not just in her choices, but in her energy, her confidence, her clarity about what she wanted moving forward. With Janelle Brown, the transformation looked quieter, but just as meaningful. Janelle didn't necessarily separate in the same visible way, but her focus clearly shifted, away from maintaining the original system and toward creating stability and independence for herself. Her decisions became more self-directed, her priorities more clearly defined, and that independence contributed to the overall redefinition of the family, because when individuals begin to operate independently within a system, the system itself begins to change. For Meri Brown, transformation was more internal. Her journey wasn't defined by one dramatic shift, but by a gradual process of realization, of understanding her place within the evolving dynamic, of recognizing that the structure she had been part of was no longer functioning in the same way. And that recognition opened the door to change, to growth, to redefining her identity beyond the limitations of the past. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose position within this transformed family remained more stable. Her relationship with Kody continued to be central, and as other relationships shifted, that centrality became even more pronounced. But even stability exists within context, and the context here had changed completely, because what once existed as one part of a larger system was now something much more focused, more concentrated, and that shift inevitably changes perception. What makes this phase so powerful is that it highlights a universal truth. Families are not static. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they become something entirely different from what they were at the beginning.
For viewers of Sister Wives, this transformation has been both surprising and revealing, because the original concept of the show was built on unity, on the idea that multiple relationships could coexist within one family structure. But over time, that idea was tested, challenged, and ultimately reshaped. And now, what remains is not the same structure, but a collection of individual journeys connected by shared history. And that shift has changed how the story is told, because it's no longer about maintaining a system, it's about navigating change, about understanding how people move forward when the original plan no longer fits their reality. Another important aspect of this transformation is how it affects expectations, for both the family and the viewers. Because when a structure changes this significantly, the future becomes less predictable, less defined, more open. And that creates a different kind of tension. Not the tension of conflict, but the tension of possibility. What happens next? What paths will each person choose? How will these individual journeys continue to evolve? For Kody Brown, this means adjusting to a role that is no longer what it once was. For the wives, it means defining their futures on their own terms. And for the audience, it means watching a story that has moved far beyond its original premise. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how this transformation has impacted the way fans interpret the entire journey, and why these changes have sparked deeper conversations than ever before. Because when a story evolves this much, it doesn't just change the present, it changes how everything is understood. As the perspective of fans continued to evolve around Sister Wives, something else began to grow just as rapidly: the conversation about the show itself. Because once viewers started connecting the dots, once they began seeing patterns, understanding motivations, and reinterpreting past moments, the discussion didn't stay on the screen. It moved outward, into fan communities, into social platforms, into ongoing debates that extended far beyond each episode. For Kody Brown, this meant that every word he spoke was no longer just part of a scene. It became part of a larger analysis. Fans began breaking down his tone, his phrasing, the consistency of his responses across different conversations. And what once may have been taken at face value was now being examined more closely than ever. Because when people start to see patterns, they naturally want to understand them. They want to know why. They want to know what it means. And that curiosity fuels discussion. For Christine Brown, the reaction from fans became one of the strongest aspects of this new phase. Her decisions, her clarity, her willingness to step away, all of it sparked conversation, not just about what she did, but about what it represented. To many viewers, her journey became symbolic, a reflection of personal strength, of choosing change when something no longer feels right. And that kind of narrative resonates deeply, which is why it became such a major focus in fan discussions. With Janelle Brown, the conversation took on a slightly different tone. Fans weren't just reacting to big moments, they were analyzing the subtle ones, the quiet shifts, the measured responses, the decisions that didn't come with dramatic announcements, but still carried significant meaning. And that level of attention shows just how engaged the audience has become, because it's no longer just about what is obvious, it's about what can be understood beneath the surface. For Meri Brown, the fan conversation has been layered and ongoing. Her journey has always invited different interpretations, different perspectives, and as the overall narrative became clearer, those interpretations only deepened. Fans began revisiting her past moments, comparing them to present developments, and trying to piece together a full understanding of her journey. And that process created even more discussion, more debate, more engagement. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose position within this transformed family remained more stable. Her relationship with Kody continued to be central, and as other relationships shifted, that centrality became even more pronounced. But even stability exists within context, and the context here had changed completely, because what once existed as one part of a larger system was now something much more focused, more concentrated, and that shift inevitably changes perception. What makes this phase so powerful is that it highlights a universal truth. Families are not static. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they become something entirely different from what they were at the beginning. For viewers of Sister Wives, this transformation has been both surprising and revealing, because the original concept of the show was built on unity, on the idea that multiple relationships could coexist within one family structure. But over time, that idea was tested, challenged, and ultimately reshaped. And now, what remains is not the same structure, but a collection of individual journeys connected by shared history. And that shift has changed how the story is told, because it's no longer about maintaining a system, it's about navigating change, about understanding how people move forward when the original plan no longer fits their reality. Another important aspect of this transformation is how it affects expectations, for both the family and the viewers. Because when a structure changes this significantly, the future becomes less predictable, less defined, more open. And that creates a different kind of tension, not the tension of conflict, but the tension of possibility. What happens next? What paths will each person choose? How will these individual journeys continue to evolve? For Kody Brown, this means adjusting to a role that is no longer what it once was. For the wives, it means defining their futures on their own terms. And for the audience, it means watching a story that has moved far beyond its original premise. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how this transformation has impacted the way fans interpret the entire journey, and why these changes have sparked deeper conversations than ever before. Because when a discussion reaches this level, it doesn't fade, it grows. As the perspective of fans continued to evolve around Sister Wives, something else began to grow just as rapidly: the conversation about the show itself. Because once viewers started connecting the dots, once they began seeing patterns, understanding motivations, and reinterpreting past moments, the discussion didn't stay on the screen. It moved outward, into fan communities, into social platforms, into ongoing debates that extended far beyond each episode. For Kody Brown, this meant that every word he spoke was no longer just part of a scene. It became part of a larger analysis. Fans began breaking down his tone, his phrasing, the consistency of his responses across different conversations, and what once may have been taken at face value was now being examined more closely than ever. Because when people start to see patterns, they naturally want to understand them. They want to know why. They want to know what it means. And that curiosity fuels discussion. For Christine Brown, the reaction from fans became one of the strongest aspects of this new phase. Her decisions, her clarity, her willingness to step away, all of it sparked conversation, not just about what she did, but about what it represented. To many viewers, her journey became symbolic, a reflection of personal strength, of choosing change when something no longer feels right. And that kind of narrative resonates deeply, which is why it became such a major focus in fan discussions. With Janelle Brown, the conversation took on a slightly different tone. Fans weren't just reacting to big moments, they were analyzing the subtle ones, the quiet shifts, the measured responses, the decisions that didn't come with dramatic announcements, but still carried significant meaning. And that level of attention shows just how engaged the audience has become, because it's no longer just about what is obvious, it's about what can be understood beneath the surface. For Meri Brown, the fan conversation has been layered and ongoing. Her journey has always invited different interpretations, different perspectives, and as the overall narrative became clearer, those interpretations only deepened. Fans began revisiting her past moments, comparing them to present developments, and trying to piece together a full understanding of her journey. And that process created even more discussion, more debate, more engagement. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose position within this transformed family remained more stable. Her relationship with Kody continued to be central, and as other relationships shifted, that centrality became even more pronounced. But even stability exists within context, and the context here had changed completely, because what once existed as one part of a larger system was now something much more focused, more concentrated, and that shift inevitably changes perception. What makes this phase so powerful is that it highlights a universal truth. Families are not static. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they become something entirely different from what they were at the beginning. For viewers of Sister Wives, this transformation has been both surprising and revealing, because the original concept of the show was built on unity, on the idea that multiple relationships could coexist within one family structure. But over time, that idea was tested, challenged, and ultimately reshaped. And now, what remains is not the same structure, but a collection of individual journeys connected by shared history. And that shift has changed how the story is told, because it's no longer about maintaining a system.
After the explosion of discussion surrounding Sister Wives, one thing has become very clear. Fans are no longer just reacting to what has already happened. They're anticipating what comes next. Because when a story reaches this level of clarity and engagement, it naturally creates expectations, questions about the future, predictions about how things will unfold, and a strong desire to see where each path leads. For Kody Brown, this means that every future conversation will be viewed through a different lens. Fans aren't just listening to what he says, they're analyzing what it means in the context of everything that has already been revealed. They're watching for consistency, for change, for any indication of how his role within the family continues to evolve. And that level of attention raises the stakes for every moment. Because nothing is seen in isolation anymore. Everything is connected. For Christine Brown, the expectations are centered around growth and independence. Fans want to see how her new chapter continues to unfold, what her life looks like moving forward, how she builds something that reflects her own needs and priorities. And that creates a different kind of anticipation, not based on conflict, but on progress, on transformation, on what comes after a major life decision. With Janelle Brown, the curiosity is more subtle, but just as strong. Viewers are paying attention to the direction she chooses, the decisions she makes, the balance she creates between independence and connection. Because her journey feels ongoing, unfolding step by step, rather than through one dramatic shift. And that makes it compelling in a different way. For Meri Brown, expectations are layered with uncertainty. Fans are wondering what her next move will be, whether her journey will lead to a clear decision or continue evolving gradually. And that uncertainty keeps viewers engaged, because her story doesn't follow a predictable path.
It invites questions. It encourages speculation. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose role moving forward remains a key point of focus. As other relationships shift, her connection with Kody becomes even more central to what remains of the original structure. And that raises questions about how that dynamic will continue to evolve. Will it remain stable? Will it face new challenges? How will it adapt to the changes happening around it? These are the kinds of questions fans are actively discussing. But beyond individual journeys, there's a bigger expectation forming. What does the future of the family look like as a whole? Because the original idea of a unified plural family has clearly changed, and now viewers are trying to understand what replaces it. Is it a collection of independent paths? A redefined version of the original structure? Something entirely new? That uncertainty is what keeps the story moving forward, because as long as the future isn't fully defined, there's always something to watch for, something to analyze, something to anticipate. For viewers of Sister Wives, this creates a different kind of engagement. It's no longer just about following a storyline. It's about trying to predict it, to understand where it's going before it gets there. And that adds another layer of excitement to every new episode. Another important aspect of these expectations is how they reflect the audience's connection to the story. Because when fans care enough to speculate about the future, it means they're invested, not just in what has happened, but in what might happen next. And that level of investment is what keeps the conversation alive, what keeps the show relevant, what ensures that every new development is met with attention and analysis. As we move into the final part, we'll bring everything together, looking at how these expectations, conversations, and transformations all connect to the core message of the story. Because in the end, it's not just about what happens next, it's about what it all means.